So you should all be getting the record notification. Hi, Seth. Hi, Yudi. So let me share my screen so I can go over some announcements here. So first thing is, congratulations. Most of you have submitted your midterm essay for this class. So at least for this class, it's in, and now I just have to grade them. So it usually takes me about a week and a half with midterms to turn around, 2 weeks to be safe, but I will start grading them this week. So I will grade them in the order in which they came in, so that as I'm grading them, you guys get the grades back. So if you submitted your essay in early, you're going to get your grade back this week. But if you waited till midnight, it's going to take longer for those to get in. In addition, everybody gets a comments on their paper so that you know why points were taken off, right? And I'm going to show you how to go back and look at comments really quickly in case you don't know. So you have to go over to your grades to look at comments. And then you want to scroll down to the assignment. So in this case, you want to scroll down to where it says midterm 13th documentary paper over here. Once you click on that, your paper will come up and you'll be able to see if I wrote any comments in the comment section, but also in your paper, I will make comments and edits. It'll be here under grades, and then scroll down to see your assignment for it. If anybody has any problems, if you can see that I graded it, but you can't see my comments, let me know, because it's really easy for me to either give you instructions or basically email you your paper with my comments, right? The other thing I keep saying, and so far I haven't heard back from anybody, but all the grades from perusal should be updated in your grade book. All the in-class essay questions should be updated. So your grade is as fully updated without your midterm grade. So check if you see any errors, if you spot anything that didn't transfer correctly from perusal, or if I missed giving you credit for a day that you were in class and somehow I missed your answer to the question, please let me know so that we can get those fixed now. It's easier to fix now than trying to figure all those things out at the end of the semester. So I just want to go remind you of that. This week, we're getting back to where we left off with our material for the class. I do have a few of you. I'm waiting for a few of your midterms. So if you use the Life Happens clause, you do have until Wednesday by midnight. Right, so don't forget that deadline. But back to this week. So we are in week 10. This is week 10. I don't have a Canvas assignment for you to do, but you do have 2 readings. Right, so you're reading Martin Luther King Jr. and you're reading 2 chapters from the Hinojosa book. Right, so remember that the Hinojosa book you're reading for how she's telling the history, what version of the history is she giving you in her memoir, because that's what you're going to write your final paper on, right? The Martin Luther King Jr. reading is shorter. So if you want to start with the shorter one, it's an article, one of his speeches. Right, one of his speeches. So I see some of you are already putting in comments on perusal. So keep doing that. If you have any issues, though, let me know. So you can see it's really short. It's a really short one. So that way you can get done more easily. What questions do you have about any of the assignments this week? So you have 2 readings. You have the Hinojosa chapters 8 through 10, right? And then the short Martin Luther King Jr. reading. No questions? Okay, then if you have questions as you start going through it, let me know. But let's get started. Today we want to talk about forced sterilizations. Right? We already touched on it weeks ago when we talked about indigenous communities. Right? We had this slide up. In the 1970s, we started basically the information started coming out that there were women from various communities that had been sterilized without their consent, meaning that they could not have children anymore. right? When it comes to indigenous communities, it's hard to know the numbers exactly. Part of why we don't have exact numbers is because sometimes people went in to the doctor for something else and then ended up being sterilized without their consent. And so some people did not know that they had been sterilized. Some people did know, but they were too afraid of the stigma around that to come forward. And so what we have is estimates based on what we know. So we have a wide estimate in terms of how many Indigenous women were sterilized without their consent. It's somewhere between 25 to 42% of Indigenous communities were sterilized without their consent at this time. Most of it happened at government operated hospitals or by government contractors. So it is hospitals and clinics that were billing the federal government. Because if you remember, for Indigenous people living on reservations, the federal government was responsible for their health care. And so it was done like at these government-run hospitals, state-funded hospitals. Other times, if they did attain consent, we believe that there was coercion. So women reported that being coerced into or kind of lied into, feeling forced into signing a consent form that allowed the doctors to perform the sterilization, right? And this is part of the bigger picture we talked about of genocidal intentions with the Indigenous community. The goal of the federal government, and because we know this because they were very explicit, they were forthright that the goal was to close down reservations and either integrate or get rid of Indigenous communities so that that land became free, and also so that they didn't have to deal with the responsibilities they had agreed to in treaties with Indigenous communities, right? So part of that bigger picture of removing Native children and trying to assimilate those populations and remove them from Native traditions, right? So we already talked about this, but this was not the only case, right? I told you this is not the only case of these kinds of forced sterilizations occurring. What other communities do you think were targeted for sterilization? Any guesses? Do you think this happened in California? Oh, someone's putting it in the chat. Yes, Latinas. Justin, yeah, we've been talking about, so a lot of non-white communities. Yeah, that is primarily where we've seen evidence of that. And a lot of it, yeah, Marissa, because of the larger families. So some of you brought up last time we talked about this, that California was at the forefront of eugenics research, right? Early in the 20th century, and then at the end of the 19th century, the most well-known eugenics research was being done in California, right? We were the leaders in eugenics, to the point where when Hitler comes to power in Germany, he actually sends people to California to look at the research and the practices we were doing here and in the United States, looking for what to implement in Germany. It's the leading research on eugenics was happening here. Specifically, one of the hubs for eugenics research was Stanford University. Right, they've done some work more recently to try to acknowledge that history, at least acknowledge some of that history. The founding president of Stanford University, so the first president of Stanford University, was David Starr Jordan. He was at Stanford from 1891 to 1913. He was a eugenicist. Right? He wrote a book called The Blood of the Nation, A Study in Decay of Races by the Survival of the Unfit. Like, this was a eugenics book. Because he was the president and because he was so well known within eugenics circles, he recruited a lot of the leading researchers that were doing eugenics research. And so he was key in making Stanford a university well known for its eugenics research, right? In fact, some of the people that were recruited during his period there and after him were people like Louis M. Terman. He developed the IQ test. right? So if anybody's ever taken any of the IQ tests, it originates with the research of Terman. He did a lot of what he called genetic studies of genius, right? He developed a test to try to develop which children were more intelligent. So the goal was to identify more intelligent children and to trace them over long periods of time, right? So he develops the questions, the questionnaires that would be given to children. And then what they end up doing them is actually checking in with them every few years, re-administering the intelligence test and seeing how they're doing to see if their test really was good at predicting who were going to be the most intelligent and the kind of best and brightest people in the area. How accurate do you think these IQ tests were and are? Are they very accurate, not accurate at all, or a little bit accurate? No? No guesses? Has anybody taken an IQ test? Someone's putting in no. Oh, interesting. Some of you have taken an IQ test. Okay, a few of you have. So how accurate do you all, especially those of you who have taken it, did it seem like it was measuring intelligence well for you? Or do you think, I don't trust that test? No. Here's the thing, right? You would hope so. That means you did well, Valerie. You must have done well. Well, it turns out a lot of those tests are not accurate at all. Not accurate at all. One of the reasons we know is, yes, Jonathan, they are incredibly biased. It's incredibly biased. Standardized tests don't actually test knowledge. What they're actually testing is your ability to take a test, to take that kind of test, right? But we know that the testing like this is incredibly biased, specifically because of examples like the kind of testing and practices that were done at Stanford. Because not only were they just testing students for intelligence and then observing them, now what they went further. Another one of the scholars at Stanford was Elwood P. Cubberley. He actually was superintendent of schools in San Diego for a couple of years before he went on to get a master's and a PhD and then ended up teaching at Stanford. He was very prominent. He was the dean of the Stanford School of Education for like a large chunk here, almost 2 decades. And his goal was not just to identify students, right? What Stanford, Terman and Cubberley were part of doing was identifying kids that would do well and then admitting them at Stanford. So they would follow these kids till they were ready to get to college, and then they would look out for these kids and admit them to Stanford. They would recruit these kids that were testing high on their IQ exams, admitting them to Stanford, making sure that they had money to attend Stanford, making sure that they had all the resources they needed at Stanford. So not only were they just passively observing kids, but they were helping these kids do better, admitting them into university and giving them everything they needed while they were students. Well, let me ask you, if we did that for you, right? If we told you all that we tested you as kids, that we found you all to be incredibly intelligent and that we were going to help you, give you everything you needed to be successful in college, how successful would you be? Very like right now, anyone who's struggling, we were like, okay, you're struggling. We're going to figure out why you're struggling and we're going to get rid of whatever problem it is. We're going to fix the problem that is making you struggle in school. Would that help you? Would anybody sign up for that? Yes, right? So this is not good practices in terms of a methodology for administering this kind of exam, right? They're not just identifying people, they're helping these kids, these people do better in life, right? People who have help through college, who have an automatic acceptance to a university because of testing they did earlier will do better. They were actually even testing some of their own kids, like the faculty at Stanford had all their children tested, and some of their children did not test as high intelligence, but ended up doing well, right? So the test didn't get everyone who they would consider to be highly intelligent and would do better. So that was a fail for the test, but they were also rigging the system, right? They were dictating that the kids they'd identified as highly intelligent would end up doing well, right? Because the university was helping them along. So it's highly, highly biased. And so we can basically throw out all of the results of this kind of testing. Yeah, Dino, this kind of methodology would just not stand up. But at the time it was. Why? Why do you think people were looking at this kind of methodology, this kind of testing and information, and be throwing money at it, right? People were funding this kind of research. They were promoting it. Why would this be celebrated research and information? Even other scientists were looking at this and like giving it their approval, even though this is highly dubious methods at best, and also like just not proper. Were the kids' chosen based on race? Valerie's asking in the chat. So mostly yes. Most of the kids tested were white. And remember, they were testing all the children of faculty at Stanford. So a lot of these were kids that came from not just white families, but highly educated families and financially well-off families. Yeah. To them, though, this reinforced the idea that they had started off with, right? Part of the intention here was to prove that white people were better and more intelligent than all other races. Right? That was the goal. And they were getting the results they wanted, right? Their results were telling them white people are smarter, they're more intelligent than all other racial groups. But they were rigging the whole thing, right? They were rigging the whole thing. They weren't doing the same, they weren't taking the same steps for non-white kids, for kids that came from lower income families. And so Marissa, it's extremely biased, right? And this is part of the eugenics project, right? This is all eugenics research, right? So it doesn't have to be medical research in order to be counted as eugenics, but this seemed to reinforce very racist ideas, right? That white people were better. So people took it a step further, not just are white people more intelligent and more deserving of resources, but non-white people should not be having so many kids. Because non-white people are not as intelligent, because they don't contribute as much to society as these highly intelligent people, then we need to do something about these non-white low-income people, right? So that's where the medicine stepped in, right? In eugenics medicine then called for not just helping people that were testing as highly intelligent, but also kind of making sure that genes that were not intelligent, right? What was considered bad genes, stopping those genes from reproducing. Well, how do you do that? Right? How do you stop certain genes from reproducing? Well, one of the ways is stop people from having more kids. Right? So this is the negative eugenics. So the way what was being done in California specifically was sterilizations, right? Making sure that specifically here Latina women were not having as many kids, right? Well, how did you do that at the time? The tubal ligations. It was for population as well. Yes, Marissa, we will get to it. So part of the fear is that actually that non-white communities were reproducing at faster rates, right? They were having more kids, and that this globally, in the US, but also globally, and that this is seen as a problem. So how do you stop those people from reproducing more? than through sterilization. Right, one of the most popular methods throughout the 20th century, and still something that's done today, is tubal ligations. Right, so for a lot of people, including a lot of women, for example, when you don't want to have any more children and you want a medical procedure, right? You don't want to use a birth control method. You want to just not have any more children. One of the options is tubal ligations. That's the medical term for it. It's more commonly known as getting your tubes tied. Right, nothing's actually getting tied, but that's what most people know this operation as, is getting your tubes tied. So what I'm going to show you now, I'm going to play you a clip of a documentary, because we know that from the 1930s through the 1970s, a significant number of Latina women were being sterilized in California without their consent. These women came out and said, actually, I did not know that this was going to be done to me. We can trace a lot of these sterilizations because they were done at LA County USC Hospital. Right? At the time, this was the hospital where a lot of Latinas went to, because it catered to a lot of low-income communities in Los Angeles. All right, Marissa, have you seen it? The documentary is called No Más Bebés. Have you seen, is it No Más Bebés, the one you saw? Has anybody else seen No Más Bebés? They gave the title in Spanish, No More Babies. It's what it would call. So I'm going to show you a few clips from them. So this first clip where you're going to hear the testimony of at least one, probably two of the women that this was done to. So remember, one, because these sterilizations were being done up until the 70s. We have evidence of them happening through the 70s. A lot of these women are still alive, right? They're still alive. And a number of them have come forward, right, to talk about what was done to them. So we're going to hear the testimony of a couple of them talking about their experience. So pay attention to how these tubal ligations were done, right? How they are circumventing the legal system, because it's not legal and it's not ethical. Right now, if you go to a hospital and they want to perform this kind of operation on you, they need consent forms. Right, so pay attention to how they get around some of that information, and what the effect on the families were, right? The impact on the people talking in the documentary. So let me play the documentary. If the audio is off, let me know. Okay, hold on. Gotta wake up the DVD. Hold on, nobody can see that, right? I think it's all gray.
No, we can't see it, but we can hear it.
Okay, hold on a second. We should be able to see it. So give me 1 second. Let me pull it back up. Oh, geez. Hold on. Let me wait for the DVD to do its thing. In the meantime, though, I can talk a little bit about the kind of setting in LA. So part of the background of what was happening in Los Angeles at the time, so we're talking in the 1930s through the 1970s, there's a new waves of immigrants coming to Los Angeles, to California, into the US, and largely from Mexico. Once we get to the 70s, you also start getting immigrants coming from Central and South America, but a large majority of the immigrants in Los Angeles at this time were coming from Mexico, right? So this is a significant community that was low income, right? They're coming primarily to do seasonal work, and also a majority of them did not speak English, right? Did not speak English. But they're also coming from usually a very Catholic background, which also for a lot of these people, they came from large families, right? One of the women you will see in the video, she talks about her mother having had 20 children. 20 children. Those are big families. Now, that's pretty big, actually. That's actually a significantly large number. But, no, now it's coming up. All right, so I'll play now, and let's see if it does play.
Ni mucha ternura, ni mucho dolor, porque mi apariencia es recia. Y yo por dentro sí siento mucho tristeza, recordar, pero aparentemente no se sale. ¿Cómo se explica? ¿Y por qué sientes tristeza volver? Pues, ¿sabes?
Okay, let me check, because all I see is a gray box, so nobody can see this, right?
I can't.
Okay, then let's listen to it a little bit, because part of it, you still get to listen to them. I'll skip ahead though to, because they're speaking in Spanish and you can't see the translation. So I'll skip ahead to where the doctors are talking about what happened in these situations. So I won't play the audio, or I won't play that clip. I'll play this next clip. Is part of it is the doctors talking about what was happening at LA County USC.
Quisiera morir de sentimiento.
Oh, he's about to start.
These are various conversations I did write down when I would talk to other doctors. Most people wouldn't believe it unless they heard it directly, so I went around with a couple of investigative reporters from the LA Times. One thing I picked up this year was a whole new prejudice. I didn't have anything against Mexicans when I came here. Another doctor said, Dr. Forster, yeah, all they do is screw, drink, and drive. 59 Chevys with ruffles on the top with baby boots.
I arrived in Los Angeles. I had no clue what Hispanic culture, language, mores, anything. We met our junior and senior residents. We had approximately an hour orientation, and they said, go. Patient interaction was a little more difficult for me.
Así oí yo que dijeron allí que ya no.
Okay, let's come back since we can't see. See, it's so weird. At the minute I stop sharing, it's Zoom. Zoom is probably because it's copyrighted material and won't let me show it to you. So, okay, we'll deal with the lack of a video clip, but you were able to hear what some of the doctors said. What were the doctors expressing in that clip? Were they expressing being happy to work with a largely immigrant Spanish-speaking community? Yeah, Valerie sent it in a direct message, but they were expressing a lot of very racist attitudes, right? They had a lot of racist attitudes about particularly Mexican immigrants. They're saying like, oh, all they do is reproduce and take government benefits. That was an attitude that was very common. And there was a whistleblower, a doctor at LA County USC, who comes in and sees all of that. And he starts kind of recording what those conversations were like, writing down those conversations, taking charts that showed that the tubal ligations, that the sterilizations were happening in really large number. These were all recorded, right? All of these sterilizations, we have documentation for them because they were being paid by the government. They were state funded, right? And so although documentation exists that these procedures occurred. Now, most of these procedures do have consent forms, right? All these women did sign paperwork that gave consent to the doctors to perform the tubal ligations. Here's the problem. What language do you think the forms were in? they were in English, and most of these women did not speak or understand English, much less read English. Yeah, you heard the singing at the beginning. It was in Spanish, right? These are Spanish speakers. And at the time they were handing forms in English to these women and telling them sign. So a lot of these women are in the hospital. Most of them were in the hospital because they were giving birth. They were about to give birth, and a doctor or a nurse puts a bunch of forms in front of you and tells you that you need to sign these forms. So a lot of women just signed without knowing what they were signing. Right. The other thing that the women in the documentary talk about is that some of them did not sign. They knew better than to sign something they didn't know, or maybe their husbands weren't there and they said, I want to wait till my husband is here so he can see the what we're signing. And the women were scared into signing the forms. They were told, you're having a difficult delivery. This is an emergency and we can't help you unless you sign these forms. So think about somebody about going into labor. They're already in labor. They're being told that there's something bad happening with the delivery. There's an emergency and she needs to sign forms now, immediately. Right? Is that a ethical way of attaining consent? No. Yeah, Marissa, no. In fact, what the organizations of doctors have said, that what is needed is informed consent, right? It's not just enough that somebody is saying yes to a procedure. Is they need to know what the procedure is, what the possible consequences of the procedure is, especially because with any medical procedure, there's always the chance of something going wrong. There's always danger. There's always negative effects that are possible. And so a patient, in order to really give consent, has to know what all the options and what all the possibilities are, right? That's why when we say in that an ethical consent is not just consent, it's informed consent. The patient needs to know those options. Yeah, Julio, it's not consent at all in these cases when it's rushed like this. Yeah, Angel, they didn't understand what they were signing. Some of these women did not know that the procedure had even occurred, right? Because they're going in to give birth. They give birth, then the procedure, the tubal ligation happens, and they're sent home. So some of these women were not told that the tubal ligation occurred. Some of these women report that they didn't find out until a lawyer came knocking on their door. Right? When the whole thing was exposed and the lawyers were trying to form a case against the hospital, that's when they found out that the tubal ligation had occurred. Some of them found out when they tried to have children. Some of them wanted more children, and they realized in the process of trying to get pregnant again that they could not. Tubal ligations are not reversible. So they felt stuck, right? Valerie says, that still happens. I have been taking my dad to the ER recently and the forms are in English. Most of the time they don't let me help him, but are so persistent that he signs. Yeah, the issue of language is, and this is why it's important actually when we have family members that don't speak the language or are not as familiar with how the medical system works, for them to have someone with them, because hospitals are supposed to provide translators, right? They are supposed to have translators, and patients have the right to have someone with them, especially when there are forms involved and a procedure is going to be happening, right? So what do you think the impact was on these families, on the women that ended up being sterilized without their consent? We can kind of take a guess on what the impact was. Do you think they ended up happy that this was done to them? No, yeah, Marissa, not at all. In fact, for some of them, because some of them wanted more families, they felt like it's been a significant emotional impact since then. right? They wanted larger families, and they're not able to have any more children. And for them, that was a big. One of the women ended up divorcing from her husband. When her husband found out that she had been sterilized, he thought that she was responsible for it, and he thought that only prostitutes got sterilizations, that only prostitutes had these kinds of procedures, because why else would a woman not want to have any more children? Only if she's sleeping around with other men. And so he divorced her. And so, because there was stigma within the community and for some of their spouses around that, around the procedure. Some of the wasn't the men signing the waiver as well for their wives. So, yeah, there were cases in which that occurred. Yeah. So, but there was a whistleblower, right? There was a doctor that came forward with the charts, with the evidence of what had happened, and there was a court case. The doctors that performed the sterilizations were taken to court. Do you think that there was any kind of ramifications, any punishment for the doctors who performed these procedures without appropriate consent? Yeah, they did not. The doctors won their case. The courts in California found that the doctors had attained consent. They had consent forms signed, and that was enough to not be legally liable for the sterilizations. So they were not found guilty, they were found innocent. And so not much had occurred in terms of that, other than the documentaries like No Más Bebés that it was informing the public that this was happening until last year. Last year, California passed a law to basically pay reparations for the women that had been sterilized without their consent. Now, it's not clear how many women have actually been paid any money by California, because in order to get paid the sum of money as reparations from the state of California, you have to apply. You have to prove that this was done to you. And I actually don't think that most people in Los Angeles even know that this is an option. Had any of you heard about this, about the payment being offered by the state of California? No, right? This is what I keep finding, is that most people actually did not know about this. And the deadline already passed. They did, I think, a 1-year deadline for people to apply for this. And there are still people in our communities that this happened to, and that they never got the opportunity to take the doctors to court or to share their stories. And now I think because the deadline has passed, the option of getting reparations from the government doesn't exist anymore. But even if they could, the money does not fix the problem. You can't undo a tubal ligation, so it does not fix the problem, right? A few other things that the documentary goes into is, this is connected to the kind of racism we've been talking about that can occur in the medical field, right? One of the things that was happening with the doctors at LA County USC Hospital was that they were coming to Los Angeles for their training, right? They would do a few years in Los Angeles. Some of them were not going to be staying in Los Angeles permanently, but they were training with some of the best doctors that worked at LA County USC Hospital. But a lot of these doctors had never worked with an immigrant community, with a largely Latina community. They did not. They came from places in the Midwest in the US where they just did not have regular contact with immigrant or Latino communities. And so they're coming to Los Angeles, and they're bringing a lot of prejudices with them. They don't speak Spanish, and they don't have the cultural knowledge to kind of interact with these patients in a better way. right? Some of these doctors will sometimes express, though, that they thought they were doing a service to the state, right? That preventing these Latina women from having children was going to save the state money in the long run, because these women or these future children would not be getting welfare from the state of California. This is a really racist attitude because they have no idea whether people were actually going to be getting any kind of government aid or not. They're making assumptions about people just based on the language they speak, the way they look, their background, and they're making assumptions about the kinds of people that get government aid, which, by the way, the studies show they're actually wrong. But these are the kinds of kind of reasoning that the doctors were giving. Right? These kinds of, one of the things that the court case in California did do was kind of reinforce the idea that any patient that is going to a doctor or a hospital for a procedure needs to give not just consent, but affirmative consent. Right, that if that a patient is signing a forms, that they need to understand those forms. So they either need to be given to the patient in the language in which they speak and read, or a translation needs to be provided. Oh, Marissa, yes, yes. When they discuss birth control, it's actually very sad. Yeah. California was not the only place where sterilizations were happening without the consent of patients. Right? Between 1929 and 1974, we estimate that there's somewhere between around 7,600 people were sterilized in North Carolina. Right? 40% of those were not white. Right? So there's a big there's a big question mark about how many of those in North Carolina. We're talking about a large Black community, right? A majority of these 40% are Black women that were sterilized. Some of them allege that it was done without their consent. But also, some of the white women were also reporting being sterilized without their consent. Typically poor white women. Right? And it's very similar situation as the case in Los Angeles, where these women were going into usually government-run hospitals, that cater to low-income communities. They might be going in to give birth or for something else. But when they leave the hospital, they've been sterilized. Right. So two things that were common in the southern states were hysterectomies, right, and the tubal ligations. Right. In Mississippi, Sunflower County, so we have numbers for certain counties where studies have been done of these forced sterilizations. So for example, in one county alone in Mississippi, right, they find that 60% of the sterilizations that occurred there were forced after pregnancy. So again, very much like the case in Los Angeles, when somebody comes in, they're giving birth and the forms are put in front of them and they're kind of scared, forced into signing something where they don't understand what they're signing, and then they leave the hospital having been sterilized. 1 year alone in this county, in Sunflower County, just the year of 1965, 60 Black women were sterilized without consent. That's a significant number. That's a significant number, right? In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement. And one of the civil rights leaders we'll be discussing is Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer becomes a civil rights activist in large part because of the forced sterilizations that she experienced. She had already experienced 2 pregnancies when she goes to a hospital. And she's going to a hospital not because she's giving birth, she's not pregnant again, she's going in for a non-cancerous uterine tumor. Right? She had a tumor in her uterus. right? And so that's all she had given consent to, is for them to perform the procedure necessary to remove the tumor, right? Instead, not only do they do that, but then they add in the sterilization, a tubal ligation, right? And it was so, her case is so egregious, particularly because she didn't know. Fannie Lou Hamer did not know that she had been sterilized without her consent. In fact, Fannie Lou Hamer finds out about the sterilization from somebody else, right? She finds out from Vera Marlowe, who was the wife of the plantation owner where she was a sharecropper, right? She was sharecropping, and it's the wife of the plantation owner that tells her that she's been sterilized. Fannie Lou Hamer then goes back to the hospital, confirms with her medical records at the hospital that she hasn't indeed been sterilized. And by the time she comes back home, like, everybody in the neighborhood knows what had happened to her. So there are layers of unethical things and illegal things happening here, right? Because these forced sterilizations are, one, illegal, but then also, how did the wife of the plantation owner find out? Well, it turns out Vera Marlowe, the wife of the plantation owner, was good friends with the doctor that performed the sterilization. And apparently the doctor was telling people that he had performed a sterilization. But that part of what that tells us, though, is how common it was for some of these doctors to perform sterilizations. Like, this doctor did not have any fear that he would get in trouble, one, for violating a patient's confidentiality, right? This is a huge violation of the law. A doctor can't just go talking to anybody he likes about a patient. That's illegal. But this doctor felt really confident talking about it to the Fannie Lou Hamer's employer. Where's HIPAA? Yeah, that's not. This is very illegal on so many levels. But also, he openly is telling people that he performed this sterilization, which makes you think that, how many others did this doctor perform, right? How many other people was he sterilizing without their consent? Now, I have given you several cases here. So we've now seen that these forced sterilizations happen to Indigenous women, to Latina women, to Black women. I haven't given you all the numbers, but it also happened to low-income white women. But most of these examples come from the 20th century, right? Most of these examples, we think the sterilizations ended in the 70s when there were court cases, right? There were court cases that tried to sue the hospitals and the doctors for this. Do you think that these kinds of forced sterilizations have stopped happening now in the US? Or in the last, let's say the last 2 decades, in the last 20 years? Do we think that they have stopped? Do you think they still have happened in the last 20 years? Any guesses? Has it happened? Has it not happened in the last 20 years? Stop sharing so I can stare you down. Jonathan says this has definitely happened at least once in the last 20 years. At least once, says Jonathan. Does anybody think it has not happened? They're like, no, we should have stopped them after those cases in the 70s. No. Does anybody think that it has happened more than once? There have been at least, yeah, Jonathan? I mean, Hobo?
I think they happen now, but not as often as some people might think it does.
Okay.
Because now every form has different languages now. which would be more understandable to people. Obviously, there's going to be cases where this events happen again, but it's just not as much as before. That's
Okay.
all.
All right. No, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, Antoinette says, I think so. Okay. Well, I have at least two other cases that, two other examples I can give you. In the 1990s and early 2000s in California, we found out about sterilizations that were happening in women's prisons, in the prison system. There's a documentary called Belly of the Beast. I think you can find it through PBS. Belly of the Beast goes through the cases of the cases in California. So this is in the 90s and early 2000s. Women in prison were being sterilized without their consent. It was a doctor that worked at the prisons. And a lot of these prisoners would go to the doctor for other pains. They were experiencing chest pain sometimes, or abdominal pain, pretty much all kinds of other things that these prisoners were going to the doctor for. And then they would leave having been sterilized without their consent. Aha, Antoinette, you've heard of it before. Yes. And this was already illegal in the 90s and the early 2000s. Sterilizing women in prison was illegal. And part of the issue is that when somebody is a prisoner, as you all saw in the documentary, their body essentially belongs to the state, right? It's a kind of enslavement. The state dictates when people wake up, when they sleep, when they eat, when they get exercise. A lot of the movement of people in prison is dictated by the state. And so how can somebody who is in that position, who is a prisoner, right, how can they give consent? Right? The law says that no, a prisoner cannot give affirmative consent when their life is so tightly controlled by the state. As a result, sterilizations cannot happen for prisoners. They're illegal unless they're medically necessary, like they're really medically necessary. And so this doctor was doing something that they knew was illegal. He knew it was illegal. But the nurse that worked for him came forward and said, yes, he was performing sterilizations on prisoners. And yes, we knew that this was illegal. What do you think his reasoning was? He knows they're illegal. Why do you think he says he still did the sterilizations? Any idea what? We have him on videotape explaining why he did it. Why do you think he did it? Yeah, Angel. Angel's telling us in the chat. He felt he was doing the right thing, that these are prisoners, that they were likely to keep committing crimes, and that he was going to save the state money by making sure they could not reproduce. They could not have any more children. Oh, Jonathan, interesting. You think someone ordered him to do it? That is the question, because there were lawyers that tried to take the state, because this is done in a prison where the state of California is legally responsible for prisoners. So there was a big question mark of who knew these sterilizations were happening, because a doctor in a prison can't just do a procedure without no one knowing it. Right? Anything a doctor in a prison does has to be documented, and it is billed. There's a lot of paperwork involved with that, and a lot of the people that supervised the prison where this doctor was performing the sterilization said that they did not know that this was happening. But there is, in the court case, it came out, there is paperwork evidence that they knew it was happening, or at very least they signed forms. They signed forms where they were signing off bills where the doctor was charging the prison for sterilizations. So at minimum, I'm not 100% sure we can say that he was ordered to do them, but at minimum, prison officials knew that this doctor was performing the sterilizations. and they knew it was illegal and nobody stopped it. Yeah, Valerie says there are so many regulations when it comes to medical treatment, and it's so particular that someone knows and are just sweeping it under the rug. That was very much the case with the prisoners in California. There was another big case that came out a few years ago. Did anybody hear about the case of the ICE detention centers?
I have
What do you
deportation,
remember? What do you remember?
like illegal, like back in 2019 there was like a large influx of immigrants
Mhm.
being forcibly removed for medical examinations and like sterilization, like you said before, and
Yeah. So the case that came out, it came out because a nurse became a whistleblower. The nurse that worked for the doctor that was doing the sterilizations came forward in Georgia. Yeah, this was at the Irwin County Detention Center. So if you were to look this up, you can see the newspaper reports at the time. So this became known because of this nurse. That migrants being held at the Irwin County Detention Center were experiencing health problems and were being sent to a doctor. Now, this was a doctor that was being contracted by ICE. So it was not an on-site doctor. It was a doctor that was off-site, off of the detention center, but where they were sending people that were in detention, migrants that were in detention. So the women would go see this doctor, and he was performing sterilizations without their consent. Right? He was sterilizing them. And the nurse finally basically came forward, and they ended up shutting the detention center. There was a whole host of other abuses happening at the detention center. Part of the problem is that migrants in ICE detention centers have extremely limited rights, right? US courts have ruled over and over again that basically parts of the Constitution do not apply to migrants in detention centers. They don't have a right to lawyers, for example, to phone calls, there's a lot of things that they don't have right to. And so that makes people that are being held in immigration detention centers very vulnerable. So there was a lot of instances in Irwin County Detention Center of sexual abuse and rape occurring at the detention center. And then when the story of the forced sterilizations came out, there was an investigation. They found that they were happening, and so they shut the detention center down. Right. However, these kinds of sterilizations are illegal, right? You can't perform this procedure on people without their consent, especially somebody who's in a kind of prison, right, in a detention center. What do you think happened to the doctor that was performing the sterilizations at the Irwin County Detention Center? Since what he was doing is very clearly illegal, do you think he was tried? Do you think he was convicted? Yeah, Angel, nothing happened. Nothing happened. In fact, he still has his license to practice medicine. So far, nothing has happened. Yeah, which is the same thing that happened to the doctors at LA County, the same thing that happened to the doctors at the California prison that was performing the sterilization. So far, I have yet to find a doctor that has faced any severe consequences for having performed sterilizations without proper consent. Why? Why do you all think the doctors haven't faced any consequences? Because these aren't like that long ago, right? Even though the sterilizations that were happening in the 70s, we're talking about people still being alive that went through that. So why have we been unable to to punish these doctors or the hospitals for these kinds of things. Any ideas? Any hypotheses? Why do you think nothing has happened? Aha, this is your question of the day. I haven't asked the question of the day. So in order to get your points for being here today, everyone has to put in the chat, has to answer the question, why do you think? So this is why do you think, right? So you could give me all the wrong answers. So why haven't there been any consequences to the doctors that perform sterilizations without consent? Okay, there's the question in the chat. So the question of the day is, why haven't there been any consequences for the doctors who perform sterilizations without consent? I'm seeing some of the answers come in. Valerie, that's a very good answer. Yeah, Seth. I think, Seth, that is part of the answer. Yeah, Angel, I think that's another reason. Yeah. Oh, Karina, yeah, for some of them it's too late and some of them have already been tried. Yeah. Ooh, Armando, yes. I think that's also part of the answer. Oh, Manuel, that's a really interesting answer. I like it. It's a complex one. Alexander, you're a bit more jaded. But I don't think you're wrong. Yeah, Hobo. Yeah. Oh, Arisbeth, nobody's brought up that issue before or so far, Arisbeth, but we're going to talk about that. Okay, so as the rest of you are writing your answers, remember, keep putting them in because this is how you're going to get the points for the day. One of the things that I saw Lisbeth talking about, and I think I saw a couple of other people put in the chat, the issue of these are doctors. What kind of position do doctors have in our society? Do we trust them? A lot of times we trust doctors, right? Or we want to at least trust doctors. The doctors, we see them as professionals who are held in high esteem in our society. And the law kind of also holds them in a high esteem. There's a kind of higher burden when you're going to accuse a professional having done something illegal like that, especially when they're protected maybe by hospitals. Yeah, and so a lot of times people don't want to believe that a doctor, somebody that's supposed to help people, has done something to hurt someone, right? It can be something that's very difficult to believe, difficult to accept, and difficult to prove in a courtroom. Yeah, a lot of you are saying, like, in terms of evidence, right? A lot of these doctors have signed consent forms. If you have a signed consent form, that is a protection, a legal protection for these doctors. And at that point, it's, at least so far, we've seen that the courts value that more over the kind of informed consent that is mandated by medical practice, right? and really the law. But as long the law seems to protect the paperwork, the fact that they have those consent forms, even if they're clearly to most people that it is clear that those forms do not count as affirmative consent. Right? It might be legal consent, but it's clear that the people who signed those forms could not possibly have given full consent because if they didn't speak the language, if it was done during a period of emergency like that, that seems to, I think for most people that's very iffy, shaky ground on which to do that. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm not going to have time to get into some of the other points, but one of the other things that was happening in the 70s was the issue of fertility rates. Right, in the 70s, the 60s, and 70s, there was a lot of talk about how global population numbers were really high, how the planet is overpopulated. Right, and that is one of the reasons why people started paying attention to, wait a minute, who's having kids? How many kids are they having? This kind of thing. Recently, I've seen a lot of, every so often, people bring up fertility rates, right? Specifically now with millennials, right? The generation of millennials, because they're at the age where they're at their highest, like when people most usually have kids. Millennials have hit the age where they should be having kids. But instead, what we've seen in fertility rates in the US is that they have gone down. Right? Fertility means how many, basically the size of families, how many kids are people having. So what this graph here shows is that people in the US have been having less and less kids, especially after 2007. Right? Why? Why do you think that people in the United States have been having less kids, especially since 2007? Valerie says, in this world, it makes sense. Yes. Why does it make sense, though? The economy, right? The economy is a big part of it. And in 2007, 2008, there was a significant economic downturn. And so actually, when a lot of millennials get asked why they're not having as many kids as previous generations, oftentimes money is an issue, right? But looking at this, there seems to be a significant drop, right, in the number of kids Americans are having. Why? Why do you think this would freak people out? Because some people look at these numbers, they see, people in the US are having less kids than ever before. Some people see this as a problem. Why would some people see this as a problem? Climate change, yeah. For some people, it is an environmental decision. When you think about the impact, actually, that's one of the elements, one of the ways we have the largest impact on the environment is having kids. And millennials in particular have shown that they're just not having kids, right? But it might be for various reasons too. So, some of them haven't. Maybe they've just delayed having kids. Like we don't know if maybe they're just going to have kids at a later age, though. That doesn't fit the patterns we've seen in the past with previous generations, right? But some people freak out. But I really want to get to this question, right? And do you have any ideas? Why would some people freak out when Americans are having less kids? This is where I see who's the most jaded of you all. I'm like, maybe Alexander can come up with a reason. Alexander, you had a pretty jaded answer before. So what some people will say is, if Americans have less kids, who are going to be the workers? Who's going to work? Yeah, there we go, Angel. Who's going to make up our workforce? Who's going to make up our workforce? Who's going to make up our military? If we have less kids, then we might not have enough of a workforce to fulfill the demands of an economy, especially if we want to keep growing our economy. Who's going to fight the wars, right? Soldiers and workers are one of the reasons historically why countries freak out about low fertility rates, right? Because this has happened before. This is not the US is not the only country that this has ever happened to, right? Japan is also facing very low fertility rates right now, and they've also been kind of freaking out a little bit because the Japanese population has now for I think 2 generations not been having a lot of kids. Their fertility rates are low, and the fear is always workers and soldiers. How are we going to fulfill those roles? But the other thing that I would suggest, and this, I'm going to leave you with this one, that a lot of times I'm not so sure that people freak out just because everyone's having lower fertility rates. Because when you look at the numbers by race, right? When you look at millennials by race, what you see is that white millennials are having less kids. What I always wonder is, are they freaking out because other racial groups don't have fertility rates that are as low, right? Because this has typically been true in the US, that the white population has had a downward fertility rate, right? White families in the US have been having less kids for several generations now. But I wonder if it's the same for Black, Latine, and other racial and ethnic groups, right? Sometimes I think that what they're freaking out is that non-white communities are having kids, and that it's the white population that is not having as many kids. Yeah. Globally, that is true. Globally, overall, when you look at the numbers at a global scale, I mean, non-white groups make up the majority of the global population. And fertility rates in non-white parts of the world are not as low as they are for white communities. So watch out for that. Whenever you see an article about how millennials, or in the future about Gen Z not having high fertility rates, always ask, okay, wait a minute, where are the numbers by racial group? Are you freaking out that everybody's not having kids, or are you freaking out about one racial group not having enough kids? But okay, I will stop here. Questions, comments? Anything someone wants to add?